професоре, дорогі наші студенти, викладачі, колеги, шановні гості з Японії.
Dear professor, dear students and other colleagues from Japan.
Маємо сьогодні особливу нагоду і високу честь і приємність вітати нашого колегу з Токійського університету, пана професора Роберта Кемпбела.
Today we have an exceptional opportunity and great honor to greet here in our university the professor from Tokyo University, Robert Kempbel, Professor Robert Kempbel.
Для нас особливо приємно на філологічному факультеті вітати вашу честь, оскільки в нас є японська філологія. І хоч Україна зараз у стані війни, але наші народи, український народ відчуває руку підтримки з боку дружньої Японії. Ми вдячні нашим японським колегам за те, що вони надають можливість нашим студентам і нашим викладачам стажуватися у ваших університетах. Сьогоднішній діалог культур, діалог художніх образів, він триває, оскільки ми маємо можливості наживо зустрітися, перемігши не тільки пандемію, але й найближчим часом перемігши лютого ворога. Оскільки наша зустріч і ваша, пане професоре, лекція про японську сучасну літературу, я маю високу приємність представити українську сучасну письменницю Галину Крук і подарувати її працю, яка єднає культури і дає символом єднання різних народів, пане професоре. Вітаю. І оскільки програма дуже насичена, я маю приємність побажати цікавого діалогу, культурної, нової комунікації, яка дасть можливість нам усім отримати не тільки нову інформацію, але й добрих нових друзів. Бажаємо гарного проведення дискусій і обговорення книг. Вірю, що техніка не підведе.
Thank you very much.
Дякую. Починаємо.
Robert Kemp, it's a great honor. It's very wonderful to meet you. I'm very thrilled to have you.
I'm very thankful to have the possibility to present
To
this
print
book.
this, yes, it's a great honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good, yes.
私にも一言ご挨拶をご紹介させていただきます。私も心から遠い日本からいらっしゃった皆様に心から感謝いたします。本当にウクライナのことに興味と同情をお持ちになり感謝いたします。今 季節です。今、1年生は、日本語の1年生は、試験を書いています。ここにいる1年生、2年生、3年生、4年生います。小さい報告、戦争の中、だから危険信号が鳴ったら皆さんは一緒に安全なところへご案内いたします。先生
よろしくです先生、本当にありがとうございます。皆さんおはようございます。先ほどご紹介に預かりました早稲田大学教授のキャンベルです。I've been told that it's probably a good idea to switch over into English. I have to apologize. First of all, excuse me, use the mic. I have to apologize, first of all, for not being able to address you in Ukrainian. I wouldn't have imagined 4 months ago or 5 months ago or a year ago that I would be here speaking with you today, so I had very little time to prepare linguistically. I spent most of my life studying, researching, and teaching Japanese literature in Japan, and it's a great honor for me, it's a great privilege to be able to visit your country, to this beautiful, historical, culturally very, very rich city of Lviv, but especially today to meet students, to get together with students, to see your faces later on, hopefully to hear your voices as well in these times of trouble. I've been told by about 7 or 8 very important people in your university today how grateful they are for me to me for joining you in such a risky time, in such a very, very difficult time. I was surprised, a little bit taken back by that, because I feel that I should express gratitude for each of you for continuing to study, for continuing to think about your own futures, as well as dealing with the stress, the anxiety. And I know that many of you are volunteering. I know that many of the upperclassmen, graduates of this fine university, are right now fighting at the front for liberty, for freedom. And I just want to pay my respects and to offer my gratitude and my heartfelt gratitude and thanks for the opportunity to meet you today. I want to begin my lecture by explaining myself, why I'm here for 2 weeks in Lviv. I'll be going on to Kiev the week after next as well. The reason is because I spent about the last 4 months translating a book through English, which was originally written in Ukrainian, through English into Japanese. And the title is right here. I think the professor has probably shared this text with you, or you may have heard of it. It's translated into English as A Dictionary of War by Ostap Sludinsky, a poet, a very fine poet, who grew up and studied at this university. He tells me for over 15 years, and continues to teach here as well. Ostap's work is, I think, is very, very important. It's currently being translated into a number of different languages into English. First, it came out in German before it appeared in Ukrainian, but in Polish, Slovakian. It's being translated in Korean as well, in English. My translation in Japanese, I expect, will be published in Tokyo before the end of the year, perhaps in September or in October. So I'm really looking forward to sending a copy of that along later on. A Dictionary of War is a collection of monologues of witnesses, war witnesses and evacuees who came from the east and the north and the south of Ukraine to Lviv last year after the full front invasion at the end of February. And Ostap was involved, still continues to be involved in volunteer work, taking care of refugees and evacuees, displaced persons. And he's a writer, a literary figure, so he would listen to each of their stories. And each of their stories had a symbolic object, or a thought, or a memory, or something that centered each of the people, each of the men and women, children who came here for shelter. And he took that one very, very symbolic, very, very important word and arranged a series of over 80 monologues, all narrated in the first person and titled, the work that you see here in Ukrainian, as a war dictionary. I came here specifically not just because I needed to meet the writer in order to translate it. I could translate this book, especially through English, in my study in Tokyo. I didn't have to go anywhere. We have lots of resources to be able to figure out what he's talking about and so forth. But through the course of translating each of the words of the refugees and the war witnesses, which are in this book, I felt that I needed to actually witness myself the scene that so many of these interviews were made in. The train station at Lviv, where tens of thousands of refugees came off of the train with their pets and their animals and their children, and also to meet, if possible, some of the men and women who contribute their voices to this very, very important text. Ostap has been extremely cooperative with me. I've spent many, many hours over the last 5 months talking with him, exchanging a dialogue with him through Zoom, through remote video from Tokyo to Lviv, asking him why he was moved to create this book, what he thought about it, whether he thought that it was a book that he had written, who actually created this book. He's taught me so many different things about the documentation of the experience of people in the middle of war, and how a writer, how an intellectual, a literary person can deal with that and turn that into a discourse that hopefully will go beyond the individual experiences of each of the people whose lives are documented in this work, to give hope and to hopefully prevent atrocities in the future, like the one that your country is experiencing right now. We spent the last 3 days, myself, a crew from NHK, which is the equivalent of BBC, it's the Japanese public broadcaster. I'm traveling together with a crew who has decided they wanted to document this trip, and have a lot of interest. There's a lot of interest building in Japan about this book, because I've been writing about it and talking about it in newspapers and so forth over the last 3 or 4 months. We're all very, very eager to meet and to actually see the actual places, the actual situations, the topos, where people were rescued and sheltered during the invasion, the first weeks and months of the invasion last year. We were able to visit yesterday the Lviv Puppet Theater, which is a beautiful theater. I'm sure all of you have been there. And we spent over 5 hours interviewing and talking to Uliana Moros, the director of that. Uliana contributes two of the stories in a dictionary of war, which I've translated. One of them is Silence. She describes the first 48 hours of when the puppet theater was opened up to refugees in early March of last year. Not just the stage and the rehearsal rooms and so forth, but also the corridors, the lobby. Almost every inch of open space was filled with mattresses. Over 70 or 80 refugees were there at once, and they all came with their families, and many of them had pets as well. And she described one of the most moving things, one of the most frightening things that she has ever experienced, as being the silence that overtook and filled this theater in the first 2 days of their sheltering. many people and all of their pets were there, and she would walk around, and of course it's a theater, so it's usually filled with joyous voices of children and adults. And she also told us that she really loves silence, because silence often means to her a room full of men and women and children watching a play which she has produced. She often sits at the back of the room and watches the plays that are produced there, and she says that she really enjoys the tension and the silence that she feels in the theater when the play is actually going on. But the silence that she felt and that she could hear in the first 2 days of this immediate transformation of the space that she had inherited and that she's working in very passionately was something that overcame her. Today, I want to move away from this text and introduce you to 4 novels which have been written, published, and read widely in Japanese by Japanese writers. I think that there are some connections between the text that I'm going to introduce to you and this enterprise, this project by Ostap Slivinsky and his collaborators. A lot of the stories, actually, he didn't hear himself. They were passed on to him by other volunteers, other people who were there. He tells me that it's an open source text. It's not his book at all. It was created by and for the refugees, but also many of the people who, like yourselves, have spent the last year helping others in their duress. I think that there are probably some connections with the text that I'm going to introduce, but nothing tangent, nothing extremely concrete. All of these books have been written and with a nation and a country at peace. Very democratic, also very capitalistic, very consumerist nation, but a nation which has undergone a great deal of change, as you all know, in the last 100 years, especially the last 70 or 80 years after the Second World War. And the generation of novelists who I'm going to introduce to you today are especially interested in the problems of self-identity, what it means to imagine oneself and to present oneself and to deal with society and the environment and changes in the environment as an individual. I've titled the talk that I've already begun for you today as Self-Identities in 21st Century Japanese Fiction. I have a surprise for you. It's not a very big surprise, it's a very modest surprise actually. The 4 books that are in front of you are the titles, the 4 titles which I'm going to introduce to you today as a sample, as an example of modern, current Japanese literature. 3 of them have already been translated into English. I believe one of them has been translated into Ukrainian as well. One of them has also become a very popular movie in Japan, and it's won a lot of awards. It's a very good movie. I recommend that you see it if you have a chance to stream it as well. The surprise is that each of the authors of these books I know from my work, and I told each of them 2 or 3 months before I came here. Once I knew that I was invited to give a lecture to you, I wrote to them, or I phoned them, or I met them, and told them that I was going to introduce their texts to a room full of students in Lviv. Each of them has signed and written in their own handwriting in Japanese a message, especially that they want to, he or she wants me to deliver to you personally today. So first of all, I want to begin by introducing the words of each of the writers that I'm going to introduce you today that have been written and I don't know how to say this in English, I'm sorry, the Japanese comes to my mind, that have been entrusted to me in order to give over to you today. I'm going to go one at a time. First of all, this book here at the left is called Konbini Ningen. It's... This was translated, it's translated in English, it's an international bestseller as Convenience Store Woman. This is the author here, Murata Sayaka. She lives in Tokyo, she's a brilliant writer, and she wrote this book, Convenience Store Woman. It was published 5 years ago, and this is the title, this is the cover in Japanese and English, and on the right side you can see, here we go, I'm going to just pick this up. On the inside, she's written a message for all of you here. Each of the authors wants me to donate this book to you, to the library here, so that you can hold it and pick it up and maybe take a picture of it. And as you continue to study your Japanese, perhaps you'll be able to use these texts as well in your studies as well. Let me read what Sayaka says here. I'm going to read this all in Japanese, and then I've also translated it into English. Ivana Franka National University の皆様へ、7年前に東京のドトールで書いた言葉です。その言葉たちが皆様と出会う奇跡に感謝します。2023年5月25日、村田沙耶香。Here I've sort of written it out into Japanese. Dotor is a coffee shop chain in Japan. It's very, very popular. Sayaka always has a rolling sort of trunk that she carries with her, and she spends her days as a sort of literary itinerant in Tokyo, traveling from one coffee shop to the other. She doesn't write at home. She needs to be in a public space with the sounds of people's voices and noises and things around her in order to concentrate and to delve into her own words. So she says here that this is books which were written, words which were written 7 years in Dotor. I've translated it like this: to everyone at Ivana Franka National University, here are words written by me 7 years ago at a Dotor coffee shop in Tokyo. I'm grateful for the miracle that these words have made their way to reach you all. May 25th, 2032. The book that I've chosen to introduce to you today, Convenience Store Woman, is essential in order to think about the problems, the various aspects of self-identity, not in Japan, but also, I think, in modernity, in the modern world, all over the place. I'm going to read you from the English, from the excellent English translation, the beginning of the book. The narrator is a woman named Keiko. She spent all of her adult life working in a convenience store, and she feels most comfortable, she feels most like herself once she walks into this very, very inorganic, bright, sort of very, very commodified space, which is a convenience store. And she becomes one with the shop, with the store itself. She feels much less comfortable when she's dealing with other people, rather than when she's actually at the counter selling things in the convenience store. A convenience store is a world of sound. From the tinkle of the door chime to the voices of TV celebrities advertising new products over the indoor cable network, to the calls of the store workers, the beeps of a barcode scanner, the rustle of customers picking up items and placing them in baskets, and the clacking of heels walking around the store. It all blends into the convenience store sound that ceaselessly caresses my eardrums. It's a very, very sort of sensual sense of the environment that melds and that blends together with her. It's almost as if her sense of identity and self-identity is not separable from the environment, from this very, very merchandised, very, very consumerist, capitalist environment around her. I hear the faint rattle of a new plastic bottle rolling into place as a customer takes out one of the refrigerator and looks up instantly. A cold drink is often the last item customers take before coming to the checkout till. and my body responds automatically to the sound. I see a woman holding a bottle of mineral water while perusing the desserts and look back down. The prose is very, very strange in a way. You're reading and it almost sounds like she's a robot. You begin to think whether this is really a person. Is there really blood running through her veins? She's so happy to be standing behind the counter in the convenience store. She has no anxiety. She feels safe. She feels like it's a haven. It's almost as if she herself is a refugee in a very, very uniform, very standardized, fluorescent, brilliantly lit up space, which she's paid very, very little money to work at. So she spends her life there, and she has a relationship with a man who works with her, but she continues to go back to the shop and to center herself every time that she's at the convenience store. This was immediately, this novel, the way that it was translated and has been transmitted throughout the world is fascinating. I met Sayaka, I know her very, very well. I met her immediately after it was published. It's been more than 600,000 or 700,000 copies of this novel have been sold in Japan. She's approaching 1 million copies, which will probably be sold this year. But she was amazed at how successful it was. And another thing that was very interesting in the context of world literature is that almost within a month of the book being published, the publisher had over 17 offers from various countries to translate it into each of the languages that they were interested in. What often happens in Japanese literature is that when an English translation comes out, people all over the world read it, in Europe, Asia, Middle East, and begin to translate it because they speak English. This didn't happen with this novel. Translators all over the world accessed it in the original, in the Japanese, and almost all at the same time, simultaneously, decided that in each of their cultures, for each of their readerships, that it would be valuable to translate this very, very simple book, but a book which forces us or encourages us to question what it is to be an individual in modern, developed capitalist society. The second novel is written by a very prominent novelist in Japan. His name is Hirano Keiichiro. Here is his book right here. In Japanese it's called Aru Otoko. In English it has been translated as A Man. Each of the writers has also given me, entrusted me with a copy of their book in English, so I'm going to leave this as well and donate it to the library so you can read it in English as well. Here's the message that he writes inside of the book. Let me show you what it actually looks like. Here it is. Let me read it again in Japanese. Ivana Franka National University の皆様、孤独と苦悩の渦中にあったとき、文学は常に最良の友でした。読者も作者も共に文学の世界の住人です。私たちは言葉によって結ばれています。平野啓一郎、2023年5月26日、日本より。I translated that in this way. To everyone at Ivana Franka National University, each time I found myself sinking into solitude and despair, literature has stood beside me as a best friend. The reader and the writer are both inhabitants of this world which is literature. We together are joined by words. Hirano Keiichiro, May 26, 2023. The protagonist of A Man is missing in ways. It is a man who was married to a woman, a man who was a lumberman, worked in forestry, excuse me, in the south of Japan, came to this very, very small town on the southernmost island of the four major islands of Japan, Kyushu, and married this woman from from that town, and he lived there and had a child with her. One day, he went out into the forest, into the mountains to cut down trees, and a tree fell upon him and killed him. He died at work because of an accident. His wife gave him a funeral, very, very sad. Everyone was very sad in the village. He was very, very loved. He was an outsider, but he was accepted and very much loved in the village. And then, in about a year, someone came because they announced his name. His elder brother visited the village to pay his respects to his brother. In Japan, we have altars in the house with a picture of the person, of a family member who's deceased, and you burn a candle and you pray for their soul. And he sat down and opened and tried to burn a piece of incense and a candle and put his hands together to pray and looked at the family altar and saw the picture and said, wait a minute, this isn't my brother, this isn't him. And at that point we discovered that the man who came to this village, married this young woman, had a child with her, and was sacrificed at work, was not actually the person that she thought he was. He had used a false identity. And from there, the mystery of this whole story begins, the unraveling of what happened, who this man was, why he threw away his identity and exchanged it with someone else's in order to create a new identity. It's a suspense story. I'm not going to tell you too much about the story today because it would give it, I don't want to give spoiler. I don't want to spoil the story for you. But it's fascinating, not simply as a very gripping suspense story about a detective, a lawyer who comes hired by this woman to discover and investigate who her husband, the father of her son, really is. But from that, each of the characters is asked, or comes to ask themselves, what their identity really is. Is it a name? Is it a passport? Is it a nationality? Hirano Keiichiro is a very important, not just a writer, a fiction writer, he's also a very important intellectual and has many opinions and thoughts and ideas about modern society as well. He wrote a book about 12 years ago, which I've translated here. It hasn't been translated in English yet, called What Am I, So-Called I, From the Individual to the Dividual. He's created this wonderful word in Japanese, which works in English also because it's a Latin word individually. His thesis is that we are convinced that we're individuals. There's this ideology that's drummed into us in almost every country in the world, that we each have our own idealized particular individual existences, and we live out these self-identities. But his thesis, his argument is that in modern society, we have many opportunities and many points of stress which we face, which allow us or force us into different sorts of identities, depending on the circumstances, whether you're in peace, whether you're in war, who you're dealing with. And so his suggestion, what he's trying to move society towards in his thought and in his ideas, is to move away from this very, very rigid individualism, which is very, very common in modern Western and also in Japanese society, towards what he calls, it's very difficult for me to say because it's not a real word, dividualism. In other words, we are divided, each of us, and we have potential to fulfill our lives with the core, of course, but also in a way that that enables us to question the environment around us and the tasks that we face as citizens or members of society today. The book is fascinating. This is the book that I told you has been turned into a movie, and the movie won a lot of awards last year. This novel itself won a very important award. Excuse me, this novel. A man won a very important award 2 years ago called the Yomiuri Shimbun, the Yomiuri newspaper novel of the year. So I really recommend it to you. If you are interested in thinking about identity and what it means to be an individual or a individual in society today. The third story which I want to introduce you to, and the writer, is a woman who has spent most of her life in the northeast of Japan, in a city called Morioka. It's in one of the prefectures which was hit and damaged very, very seriously by the 2011 great northeastern Japan earthquake and tsunami. She's lived there through the reconstruction also of society herself. This is her picture. Her name is Kimura Kumi. Here's her name in English. She put in this really, really very nice piece of stationery so that the ink wouldn't blot at the beginning of it. This is the message that she's written for everyone here today. The novel that I'm about to read to you a little bit from the Japanese is in the process of being translated into English right now. I asked Kumi if the translation was going to be out, I'd like to bring it along as well and read it to the students. And she says, I would really like you to do that. So she contacted her translator, who is in the United States, and asked if she could share some of the text. It hasn't been published yet, but the translator says no, it's not ready yet. I don't want anyone to listen to or read the words before they're actually finished. So we'll have to wait a couple of months before this very, very good novel is available in other languages. I've chosen this novel today for some personal reasons as well. Last year, this book, which I've translated myself as Someone's Safe for You, won a very important literary prize last year. It's called the De Mago Prize for Literature. Of course, there's a very, very famous cafe and restaurant in Paris called De Mago, and in Japan there's an association which has created a literary prize each year. One jury. It's very unusual in world literature because usually juries are made up of 5 or 6 or 10 people, and they decide which among the books that had been written that year deserves the prize. This prize is chosen by one member of a jury who is appointed every year. So every year there's a new person that this organization asks to read through all of the books that come out in the year and choose, for whatever reason that they feel that this is a worthy book. Last year, I was the jury. I was the judge of this. So I spent a lot of time reading dozens and dozens of novels and poetry albums and all kinds of other stories which were published last year in Japan, and I chose this novel from among all of them to win this prize. Here are the words that she's written. Dear Ivana Franka National University, 作家のミハイル・ブラコフ、映画監督のセルゲイ・パラジャノフは私にとってとても大切な芸術家です。2人と縁の深いウクライナへいつか必ず行きます。リビウで料理を習ったことのある知人が北海道に今素敵にいます。素敵な町だと聞いており憧れです。木村久美、2023年5月14日、岩手県盛岡市。She's the only person who wrote the name of the town that she lives in. It's very, very important to her that you know where she is living. These are the words that I copied out. I've translated it this way, her words. Dear Ivana Franka National University, the author Mikhail Bulgakov and the film director Sergei Parajanov are two artists that are very important to me. I'm determined someday to visit Ukraine, the land where both men found their roots. One of my acquaintances in Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island of Japan,
studied cooking in Lviv, and I hear from her that it's a lovely town. I'm longing to get there. Kimurakami, May 14th, 10,023, excuse me, I made a typo here, 2023, Morioka City, Iwate Prefecture. This story, I'm just going to read you just a little bit from the beginning of it. It's a very strange story about a man and a woman who find themselves in the same house in a very, very small town in the northeast of east of Japan, which was struck 10 years ago by a catastrophic tsunami. It's the woman's parents' house, and both she and the man, they're strangers, find refuge, they find solace in this house. Both of them have fled, have escaped from their daily life. The woman was a teacher in middle school. The man was a security guard. Both of them seem to have made a very, very serious mistake in their job, which led to the death of a student and also to a woman. Her student, the woman's student in middle school was being bullied by the students around her. You know that bullying is a very, very serious problem in Japanese education. So this young boy was being bullied, and she didn't notice it. She didn't realize what was going on in the classroom, and he commits suicide. And she becomes blamed by the parents and by the community around her, so that she's driven from her job, although she's not responsible legally for his death. The man that is in the same town as her was working as a security guard in Okinawa in front of one of the American military bases. There are a lot of protesters in Okinawa protesting against the presence of American military in Okinawa because since the Second World War, a great deal of land, very, very valuable land in Okinawa has been has been occupied by American military forces, and a lot of the people in Okinawa resent that, and there are constant protests about that. Anyway, he was guarding one of the military bases when one of the protesters approaches him, and he tried to remove her from the scene, and she tripped and fell over, hit her head, and passed away. And so he was driven from his job. He was criticized and ended up in the north of Japan, escaping from everyone, from society itself. And they meet each other, but they don't know each other, and they don't fall in love. There's nothing romantic at all about their situation, but they try to sort of protect each other in this house. The house is almost like a pod or a sanctuary, protecting them from voices, from the eyes and the rumors and the gossip of people around them. It's a fascinating story. The way that she writes it is very, very engaging. I'm really looking forward to seeing how it's going to be translated, because the prose is very, very short. Each of the sentences is very, very short. It's like staccato, sort of progressing and progressing, and it's not rhetorical at all. It's very, very spare. But as you read it, you become really, really more and more engaged in the minds and in the sense of identity that both of these two people have once thrown away and are trying to regain and save themselves. Just let me just read a couple of lines from the first page. お風呂の排水口の清掃に伺いました。4月半ば頃のある日、冬物のパジャマの上から綿入れの斑点を羽織り、昼ご飯を終えたタエはインターホン越しにシャチホコばっていそうに上ずった便利屋の声を聞き、カレンダーを確かめた。明日じゃありませんか？いえ、今日の予定で明日以降は別の予約が。玄関にはタンポポと姫踊り舗装、大犬のふぐりを飾った花瓶の横に、先々週東京から来たという男からもらった紙袋が置きっぱなしだった。ドア越しに ちょっと待ってくださいと呼びかけ、紙袋を2階の部屋へ運び、着古したタートルネックとカーディガン、コージュロイのズボンに着替えた。It just begins with the door chime, ringing this man in a very pretentious-sounding voice. She can hear his voice over the intercom and says, "I'm here to fix your plumbing. There's something wrong with the water." And she says, "Wasn't this supposed to be tomorrow?" And he says, "No, our appointment is today. I have another engagement tomorrow." So she prepares to open up the door, and this is the beginning of the story, the beginning of their story, where they meet and they begin to protect each other and to question each other and to regain their identities in life, as I was explaining. The final author, the final novel that I'm going to introduce today is by a woman named Yu-Miri. She's a Korean national who lives and was born and brought up in Japan. We say zainichi, she's a zainichi chosenjin, or zainichi kankokujin, depending on whether it's North Korea or South Korea. And her grandparents, I understand, emigrated, or not immigrated because Korea, the Korean Peninsula was a colony of Japan from 1910 until 1945. So her parents crossed over to Japan, and she was brought up speaking as a Japanese native, speaking and writing in Japanese. And she's a very, very important, very provocative novelist who, in 2014 wrote a book named Tokyo Ueno Station. In Japanese it's called JR Uenoeki Koenguchi. This won the award 3 years ago. I'm sorry, there's this SS there. It doesn't mean anything. She won the award 3 years ago in the United States, a very, very prominent, very important award for literature, the National Book Award for Translated Literature. She's one of the most prominent voices among Japanese writers in the world today. She also wrote a message which she would like me to read aloud and leave with you today.
This is what it looks like. It's rather long, so it extends over to the next page as well.
Again, I'll read it first in Japanese. Ivana Franka National University の皆さんへ、戦争は問いを奪います。人間を一つの答えに追い詰めます。あるいはなぜという問いで行く手を塞ぎます。戦争の最中にあるからこそ文学作品を読み語り、互いに問いかけ合うことが重要なのだと思います。私はいつかレビューを訪れ、皆さんと問いが響く時間と空間を生み出したい。そしていつか皆さんも福島を訪れてください。その時を心待ちにしています。2023年5月24日、Yu-Miri. Here's what the words look like in print. Let me read my translation to you. To everyone at Ivana Franka National University, war robs us of our questions. It corners us into giving one single answer. When it doesn't, it blocks our way with the question, why? In the midst of war especially, I believe that reading and speaking about literature and exchanging questions among ourselves are really important. One day, I want to visit Lviv in order to generate a time and space where questions will echo one off the other. Excuse me, this is another mistake I'm making here. One off the other. One more thing. All of you, please visit Fukushima. I'll be waiting with an open heart and arms. May 24th, 2023, Yu-Miri. Yu-Miri has spent almost all of her life in New York, in Tokyo. After the great earthquake and tsunami in 2011, she moved to Fukushima Prefecture. You will recognize from the sound of Fukushima what that is and how important that is, and perhaps the reason that she decided to move to that prefecture. It's the site of the nuclear plant which melted down and created an enormous ecological and humanitarian disaster 12 years ago, and which continues to be a disaster. Tens of thousands of citizens from a very beautiful, very rural, very fertile corner of Japan were displaced. Refugees, displaced people are still scattered all over Japan, especially in the northeast of the Kanto area. Yumiri moved there to Fukushima Prefecture, to a small town in the south of the prefecture called Minami Soma, to open up a cafe and a bookstore. She calls it the Full House Cafe. She's the owner of it, and she has a number of employees, collaborators, young men and women who perhaps have not been able to find their place in society, whether they're from Fukushima or they come from other parts of the world. Fascinating young people who get together and help her and have come together to create or to reconstruct or reconstitute a community of people, a sort of public space in Fukushima for people who are just interested in getting together to drink coffee and discuss and read books. She invites people writers from all over Japan to give readings there, to do workshops, and also it hasn't opened up, it's going to open up in a couple of months. She's also constructing a small theater next to the cafe in order to produce plays, which she's also a very productive playwright, and she's written a lot of plays, so she wants to, she has a number of actors and producers and directors who want to stage her plays there. So the next time you come to Japan, when you come to Japan, please don't just stay in Tokyo or Kyoto or Osaka, okay? Please visit Morioka, where Kimura Kumi lives. It's a beautiful city, further to the north. And also, I really recommend you to visit Fukushima and Minami Soma. And as Yumiri says in her words to you today, she's really waiting for the time, a more peaceful time, when you'll be able to visit her and exchange ideas. And as she says, to exchange questions. For her here, she says that one of the most important things to do is to question ourselves, our identities, our reality, and to exchange questions and queries among each other as equals. I want to just read a couple of sentences from her book, Tokyo Ueno Station. Ueno Station is a major train station in the middle of Tokyo. It's the station where, after the war, tens and tens of thousands of laborers migrated into the big city from the northeast. The northeast of Japan has traditionally been, it's a very culturally rich, but very poor. It has been a very poor part of the country. So many men and women were forced after the war, because of their circumstances, the circumstances of their birth, to travel to Tokyo and work in factories and to recreate and reconstruct the capital after the war. Excuse me. The protagonist of this story is a ghost. It's a man who has died and revisits the areas, the place that he migrated to in Tokyo from his original city, his original town in Fukushima, where the author actually lives. He traveled as a young man to Tokyo in order to contribute his labor to the construction of the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. A lot of highways and freeways and buildings, subways were built in the early 1960s in order to greet the world after the war during the 1964 Olympics. This was a very important historical opportunity for Japan to rejoin the international community after the the years of fascism and the disaster that the Second World War, the Pacific War, left Japan in itself. So he was one of the, the masses of laborers who came to Tokyo in order to do that. But he found that his labor, his life, his identity was not worth very, very much after all of his labors. And he ends up homeless, as a homeless man in Ueno Park. There's an enormous, very beautiful park, somewhat similar to the beautiful park in front of the university that you have here, which from the late 70s and the 80s and the 1990s was home to many homeless people. And still there is a smaller community of homeless men and women who shelter there in that community. He became homeless. I don't want to tell you the rest of the story, but I've already told you at the beginning that he's a ghost, so you know that he dies. But you know from the beginning of the story that he's dead. And he revisits the scene of his last years there, and he reminisces about his years and the family that he left in Fukushima. He wasn't able to bring his family and his children with him to Tokyo. He spent his whole life sending money to the provinces, the earnings that he had made, and he dies alone, unprotected, basically unable to be sheltered in this environment. Let me just read you a couple of sentences from the beginning of the story. This is in the consciousness, in the mind of the hero, the protagonist of this story. There's that sound again, that sound. I hear it, but I don't know if it's in my ears or in my mind. I don't know if it's inside me or outside. I don't know when it was or who it was either. Is that important? Was it? Who was it? I used to think life was like a book. You turn the first page, and there's the next, and as you go on turning page after page, eventually you reach the last one. But life is nothing like a story in a book. There may be words, and the pages may be numbered, but there is no plot. There may be an ending, but there is no end. Left behind, like a sculpted tree on the vacant land where a rotted house has been torn down. Like the water in a vase after wilted flowers have been removed. Left behind. But then, what of me remains here? A sense of tiredness. I was always tired. There was never a time I was not tired. Not when life had its claws in me, and not when I escaped from it. I did not live with intent. I only lived. But that's all over now. That's the beginning of the book, the beginning of his monologue. He talks to us, goes back, revisits all of the places that he spent his last year, and it's very fantastical, but it's also a revision, a look back at the years of Reconstruction after the war, what modern, a retooling, regeneration of Japanese society meant for individuals and for identity. The scars and the trauma that very, very advanced, very, very fast modernization and industrialization left on individuals' bodies and on their souls and in their minds as well. It's a very thought-provoking story, very novel, but it's also extremely engaging. And I didn't read it very well at the beginning, I'm afraid, but each of you, I hope, will be able to take it in hand and read through it, either in English or in the Japanese version that Umi has entrusted to me today. I want to end up today introducing to you some other messages which have been entrusted to me more recently. I have an SNS presence. I tweet a lot. I have a Facebook page, and I do Instagram as well in Japan. I have a good number of followers on Twitter. I don't usually talk about this in English, that's why it sounds funny. On Twitter, and yesterday I was preparing the last preparations for my lecture today, and I looked at the beautiful poster that the professor made for my lecture today, and I thought, wow, I should share that with everyone in Japan. And so I took a screenshot of it, and I wrote on the text that I was going to meet everyone today, and that I had been entrusted with very, very powerful words by 4 writers who were on the poster. They were kind enough to write their names on the poster so everyone could read them in kanji. And I'm going to read out these messages. Do you have something that you would like to convey to the students and to the people at the university that I'm going to today? You have 24 hours. It's 6:12 right now in the evening in Japan. I said you have until 4 o'clock in the afternoon to send me a message. It's Twitter, so it has to be short. But if you have something that you want to convey to the students, I'll be happy to relate it to them at the end. And I'm sure that they will have something to say to us as well. And I promise you that I will relay what the students, what message they have to return to you as well. Okay? Keep your ears open, okay? And prepare please to respond to some of the messages that have been recently in the last 24 hours tweeted for you from people all over Japan, younger people, older people. I don't know, most of them are handles, you know, they're fake names, so I don't really know if they actually exist. The first tweet that appeared within 5 minutes of actually putting it up was by this one person. 日本には1000年前に女性によって書かれた源氏物語という小説があります。文学の発達と広がりによって2000年前の江戸時代ではたくさんの庶民が物語を楽しむことができました。今の日本のアニメや漫画はそこをここちょっと間違っているんです。後で訂正を書いてくれたんですね。源流としています。ここに源流 it says pistol. That's not what she meant. That was a mistake. 源流としています。In Japan, there is a very old novel which was written 1,000 years ago by a woman called The Tale of Genji. Because of the development and the wide dissemination of literature, 200 years ago in the Edo period, a lot of very common people all over the country were able to enjoy and share stories among themselves. This is the origin, this long history, this elan of history are the origins of modern Japanese anime and manga. She wanted me to relate that to you, okay? Or he, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's a man or a woman. 言葉の豊かさは人間としての豊かさ、そして文化の豊かさにつながっていると思っています。皆様が文学に興味を持って学ばれていることは、皆様の未来の豊かさにきっとつながっていくと思います。困難な状況においても学びを続けていらっしゃる皆様を尊敬します。The richness, the abundance of words are precisely the abundance and the richness of us, of human beings ourselves. And the richness of culture is through words, something that is connected, I believe. The fact that all of you are interested, show an interest in literature, is proof that your future is going to be rich and that there is going to be an abundance in your future as well. I believe in the connection of your interest here today and what that will mean for you in the future. I respect very deeply everyone for continuing to study in these very, very difficult times. Here are a couple of other ones. 文学は心を生かすもの、争いも、犠牲も心に傷をつけていくでしょう。傷を負って凍えた心にかけるブランケットのようなものが文学なのだと思います。近い未来、憂いなく文学を通じて喜怒哀楽を表現できる生活が戻りますように。I have to apologize for not having translated these in advance. I mean, they just emerged from cyberspace, and I didn't have time this morning. I was cutting and pasting and deciding which ones to show you. I have to tell you, there are over 100 of these. I mean, dozens and dozens of messages by people. I don't want to brag about likes. You know, that's not important. But there are more than 1,000 likes, and hundreds of people have written comments and retweeted my invitation to send messages to you. And I'm sure that when I get back to my hotel, there are probably going to be more messages for you. I mean, everybody, I'm late sometimes. I don't always follow deadlines, but I'm sure that there are a lot of people who are interested in sharing their words with you. This person, Hikaru, a man or a woman, I can't tell, says that literature is something which keeps the heart alive. Struggle, war, conflict, and the sacrifices that go with it injure, wound our hearts. I believe that literature is a kind of blanket to cover our hearts which have been frozen, which have been chilled to the bone after being wounded. In the near future, I pray that all of you will be able to express and feel and exchange happiness, anger, joy, and sadness through literature, and that your daily life, normal, peaceful life, will return. The next person says very simply, Ukraina no koto o omoi tsuzukimasu. This is perhaps one of the most, I think, thoughtful expressions, and a lot of people say the same things. Ukraine continues to be in my heart. Ukraine is something which I'm always thinking about. Austria ni sumu nihonjin desu. I'm a Japanese person who lives in Austria. 皆さんが私の母国の文学に興味を持ってお勉強されていることを嬉しく思います。一人、友しのもとに文を広げて見ぬ世の人を友とするぞ。雇用の慰む技なる。つれづれ草健康防止。This woman who lives in Austria has quoted a classic of Japanese literature, Essays in Idleness, つれづれ草, which was written in the 14th century in Kyoto. One of the sentences in this ancient almost 1,000-year-old text is one of the greatest pleasures and one of the greatest solaces, one of the things that makes one feel most relaxed in the world is when one is alone and a simple lantern is shining and you open up a book and read the words and meet with a friend from another age. This is one of the most relaxing and most saving things that exist in the world. What Kenko Hoshi, the author of this, was trying to say is that he lived in a time of great turmoil, of war, natural disasters in Kyoto, and so forth. And to be in solitude and to read and open a book and to read literature and to discover oneself in the experiences of people who lived 10, 20, hundreds, perhaps 1,000 years ago is one of the greatest ways of preserving one's identity and one's sanity in the world. So from Austria, she lives in Austria, she wanted she entrusted me with these words to share with you from classical Japanese literature. Let me just introduce one or two more. ダムが爆破されたノバ・カコフスカ出身の友人と私は戦争が始まってから文学についてたくさん語り合っています。文学は時に、私たちの心を代弁してくれたり、時に救ってくれます。文学が好きなことで他者と通じ合えることがたくさんあると気づきました。皆さん学び続けてください。I have a friend who is from the area Nova Kakhovska, where the dam has just been breached and tens of thousands of people are stranded right now. I don't know if this is a man or a woman, but with this person I've spent many, many hours going back and forth talking about, especially since the war began last year, literature. We've had many, many conversations about literature in the past year, especially. Literature is something which sometimes can represent or represent our heart, can take the place, can give words to what we feel in our hearts, and sometimes can save us, can provide salvation for us. I was able, through my conversations with my friend, to understand and to realize that liking literature, enjoying literature, and communicating about literature, through literature, with an other, is something that's very, very important. All of you, please continue in your studies. Don't stop studying. That's what he's talking about. A lot of people ask me to convey the message that they want you, they're hoping that you're able to continue with your studies. I think that they're imagining themselves in a similar sort of situation. They have a lot of empathy with what citizens, what's going on here in Ukraine right now. And the next person says, don't give up on wanting to learn, on the position and the actual shape of yourself when you're trying to learn. Knowing, knowledge is power. そして文学は素晴らしいものです。自分を支えてくれる一冊をぜひ見つけてください。心から応援しています。Literature is something which is wondrous for us, and it gives power. Please discover one book, one volume, which will support you and which will work as support for you in your life. I support everyone, and I want to give my support to all of you from the bottom of my heart. This goes on and on, dozens and dozens of messages which have just arrived on my account. I'd like to be able to introduce all of them to you, but I think each of the people who are alive, they're probably preparing dinner or working or overworking in Tokyo and other areas of Tokyo right now, are imagining what's going on in this classroom right now. And I think that words, literature itself, but also words and actual situations, actual meeting and exchange of words and ideas and questions, like Yumiri says, is something which is essential to us. To keep our hearts in balance, but also to imagine tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, or a day which is less difficult than the times that we're in right now. I don't have any words of wisdom at the end of myself to deliver to you. I'm the messenger today for novelists and hundreds of people in Japan who follow me and are interested in literature and culture and so forth, and we're very, very eager to share their words with you today. I want to finally, once again, thank Professor Olena, the deans here, all of the staff, all of the very, very kind people whom I've met, Ostap Slavinsky, who is in the back of the classroom right now. He has come to join us at the end, and everyone here in Lviv. For your attention today, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions if we have time afterwards. Again, thank you for listening.
興味深い講義を聞かせていただいてどうもありがとうございました。心から感謝いたします。このメッセージもとても面白くてほんの気持ちだと思います。ありがとうございました。皆さん、この講義についてどうぞ遠慮なく話し合いましょう。
I'm sorry, I can only do it in English or Japanese, whichever. But I really do want to. I wonder if anyone has questions. What's going on in Japan? It doesn't have to do with the contents that I taught today. Anything that you'd like to ask me, or say something more. Yes, thank you.
I will start.
Yes, Ariana, thank you very much.
I would like to ask you about modern Japanese literature. What generation is the most active and most bright now.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. I've never really thought about this sort of literary scene in writers in Japan by generation. We have some very, very elderly writers, men and women who are brilliant. The Nobel Prize winner, Oe Kenzaburo, just passed away a couple of months ago, and there are many women and men of his generation who continue to write. There's a wonderful poet, a Japanese poet named Baba Akiko. She's in her late 80s, I believe. She's very active, writes many, many poems. She writes plays, and she's recently been writing a lot of essays as well. So I don't want to single out one particular, sort of sector age-wise, but I would say that the writers that I've introduced to you today, perhaps very, very early 50s, most of the writers today are in, which I've introduced to you today, are in their 40s. Hirano Keiichiro, Murata Sayaka, they're in their early 40s. And they're one interesting aspect, one interesting development in Japanese literature in the last 10 or 15 years is that many writers live in the provinces. This probably sounds strange in other countries, in Ukraine perhaps, but before the war and after the war, if you wanted to be a writer, a prominent writer, you almost had to live in Tokyo because that's where all of the media, all of the editors, the newspapers, the whole scene was in Tokyo. So it's a very, very, it's like France in a way. Everyone you had to be in Paris before the war and after the war to be a prominent writer. And that's changed very, very much in the last 10 or 15 years. Kimura Kumi is from Morioka. Yu Miri, who grew up and spent most of her life in Tokyo, is now in Fukushima as well. So it's sort of dispersed geographically. And it's also very, very dispersed generationally as well. Another very important aspect to think about and approach modern Japanese literature right now is that there is a new generation or wave of women writers. Most of the important international prizes, like Yumi's American Book Prize Award, have been given to women's voices, to women writers who express not just women's voices, but human voices, but especially the experience of women. Kawakami Mieko is a writer, also in her 40s, who's very, very popular now in English and in other languages, and she's had a lot of awards and so forth. Ogawa Yoko is another writer, Yumiri is another writer, and more recently, Murata Sayako, whom I've introduced, has suddenly become very, very popular all over the world. There isn't one thing in common among the writers of this generation, but it's fascinating for me to see because there's not a tight community of writers like there used to be in Tokyo. It's very, very dispersed. Everyone is very, very working individually, and it's a very, very varied, very, very diverse scene, which is something interesting. What would you say about Ukrainian literature right now? I'd like to return the same question to you.
From some point of view, we have the same situation, and now we have very active literary process, especially in the time of war, and I see it as a abnormal growing.
Abnormal growing.
Yeah, it's very interesting because sometimes people who were before very far from literature now write something about and try to show their emotions and their experience of living in war, in wartime. Yeah.
And that crosses generations, I imagine.
And now we have the same situation that we maybe the generation near between 40 and 50 is the most active in recent literary process, but not only. We have very bright young generation, maybe not generation, but separate writers, poets from very young generation, and we have very actual elder writer from maybe near 70 years old.
As well.
But it's very interesting, this variety, as for me, it's very hopeful in our situation.
Great, thank you very much. I think it's fascinating to me the word that you said at the beginning, that you feel it as an almost abnormal growth, but something which has a sort of seed or an essence of something that's hopeful in it as well, perhaps. Can I ask, we talked about this, Ostap and myself, I heard a lot of things, just yesterday, about what you're talking about people who give voice to people who generally don't write poems and don't write things and have begun to write poems. And I know that Ostap Solinski is involved in anthologizing some of these voices and so forth. Can I ask you to respond or to give us a few words about what Hanina just mentioned, this sense which she described as a sort of abnormal growth, a sort of diversification of literature in Ukraine today. Do you have any thoughts about that you may be able to share with us? If I can call on you at the end of the day.
Thank you, Tara. I'll just agree with Helena that we really have a kind of burst of new poetry, a new poetry of the new times, a poetry which tries to identify itself in a completely new situation and to find words to express absolutely new experience for us, for most of Ukrainian society. And I'd say, I'll give a short citation, short reference to what Helena said during the opening, I think, of the Berlin Literature Festival. We decided, I don't know whether Helena knows it already, but we have decided to include this text in this anthology. You know, I'm very happy that you know about it. But I think that this text is a very good explanation of what is going on now in Ukrainian poetry. And the new shape, the new function poetry plays now in the times of turbulence, in the times of very, very hard experiences. Poetry is getting more simple. It's getting rid of a metaphor as a sense of game, as a sense of semantic play. We cannot afford to play with words, to play with meanings anymore, because we live in a time of simplification of our life, and in a time when our daily life is necessarily being simplified to the most basic things, and also the poetry is becoming, as Helena said or wrote in this text, it is a prayer is a prayer, a lullaby is a lullaby, a mourning is a mourning. Farewell words are farewell words. A testament is a testament. So poetry is already not play with kind of tradition. We are completely out of postmodern situation now. War is something profoundly archaic, maybe something profoundly timeless, which is happening in no time. No time, but unfortunately in a very individual space, but in no time. And we began writing in a very timeless way, I think. This is my impression. And I'm really impressed that during this 1 year, because the anthology includes the Ukrainian poetry written between February 2022 and more or less February 2023. During this year, Ukrainian poets managed to write many times more during the whole previous period of many years, 5, 6, 7 years. So we have a real explosion of poetry writing. I can't say I'm happy because I would like huge part of this poetry never to appear, never to be written, because it's a poetry of bad times. But we have what we have, and we have to try the very, very best we can do in writing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ, and you. Glad to hear your words. I want to. It's getting into lunchtime, and I'm sure everybody's probably hungry. But I really do want to hear some voices, perhaps some responses to the messages that young man raised his hand. Would you like to stand up? Yeah, go ahead. I don't have a mic. This is the only mic that I have. No, that's okay. Don't worry. I'll guide you.
この会議ありがとうございます。質問はこの本について、一節目、このコンビニの人間。先生、僕は言語者としてこの問題に興味がある。それは質問はこの本の日本語での名前はコンビニ人間。英語の翻訳はコンビニエンスとはウォーマン。質問はどうしたこの違うの名前はどうしたこれはいお願いします。
ありがとうございます。You asked me this question in beautiful Japanese, so I'm going to reply in Japanese and then sort of repeat myself in English. The original title is Convenience Store Human. Why did that turn into Convenience Store Woman in the English title? コンビニ人間は一つはコンビニ私は村田さんに聞いたことはないんです。彼女も多分分からないかもしれないですね。これ翻訳者が決めることですが、コンビニ人間はすごく語呂がいいですね、日本語で。コンビニの女性とかコンビニ女っていうのはちょっとタイトルとしては、ちょっと言いにくいし意味が違うんですね。なのでコンビニ人間は、つまりもうコンビニになってしまった人間っていうような一つとしてあるんですね。
でこの人間言葉の言えばこれ人じゃなくて、世界とか、人生とか、いろいろな質問たくさんの意味が
あると思います。もう一つはですね、多分これは海外で、実際に手に取って買ってもらうのに、ヒューマンよりもヒューマンは多分英語であんまり訴求力あんまりインパクトがないので Convenience Store Woman という方が具体的具象的ですね。もう一つ私は英語版にもイギリス版とアメリカ版と実は表紙が全然違っていてこれとても面白いことですけれども国によってこれはもう20カ国以上いろんな言語に翻訳されてますが想定は一つ一つ違うんですね。読者がコンビニその国の人たちがコンビニをどう思っているのか日本をどう思っているかそこにいるらしい女性をどう想像するかということです。ここは日本でお弁当を買うときに必ずついてくるお醤油ちょっと魚の形をした醤油入れがついてるんですね。これなかなか面白いんです。でも他の国のものでは女性の顔であったり、おにぎり、人間の顔をしたコンビニのおにぎりとかそういうものも、あってそれはすごく 面白いなというふうに思います。The question was, why does the convenience store human become a convenience store woman in English? And that's very interesting, but it's a very, very prosaic answer in a sense. The word, it sounds really, really good in Japanese. And convenience store human, it sounds like a sort of entity in itself. It's a human has a convenience store which has turned into a human, or perhaps a human being who has melted together and become one with the convenience store. There's something about the term in Japanese which sounds really, really good. And if we say a convenience store woman, it actually almost sounds degrading. It almost sounds like there's a lack of respect for whoever this woman is. And it doesn't sound like that in Japanese at all. So I think that's that different sort of connotation that we have for both of them. But thank you, that was a very good question. Any other comments and questions? Come on. I want to see some hands. There you go. There's a woman in the third.
Yes, so my question will be rather general. What literary genres, apart from manga, are the most popular with young people nowadays in Japan?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, manga continues to be really popular. Anime continues to be really popular also. But games, computer games, social games, for example, I can't tell you the name of many of them because I don't play myself. But you'll walk around and you'll see people sitting around. Many of the people who, everyone all over the world is looking at their smartphones when they're riding the bus or the train, but a lot of young people in Japan are playing social games on their computers, and they're connected with someone somewhere else in the country or in a different time zone or something like that. And a lot of stories and movies are generated from these games. A lot of stories become movies and then they move into games as well. So there's a lot of mixed media. Today I introduced A Man, which has become a movie, but a lot of writers who are very, very popular, sort of popular novelists, will write stories that become games. And then they become anime, or then they become manga or something like that. So there's this really free sort of movement among different sort of genres and devices and so forth that people use as well. What about in Ukraine right now? What young people of your generation, what people of your generation are most interested in right now?
Postmodernism literature and writers like Serhii Zhadan, Renos Debutko, and their novels. But unfortunately, a lot of their compositions are about the war, so young people really feel through it, feel in their books. Yes.
They feel a lot through reading those books. Thank you for giving some specific authors and titles and the things that have later on. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. How about over here? There's someone in the back who has something to say. Speak up in a loud voice. Okay?
I have one question for studying pupils. Okay. What literature would you recommend it for foreign students studying Japanese? Like our, we are studying Nihongo. Nihongo を勉強している。はい。So what literature would you recommend it for us?
Great. In other words, in order to read it in the original, right? Not in translation, but in Japanese. Is that what you mean?
Oh, in Japanese or English?
Or English, okay. Well, the four books that I introduced to you today, I was imagining, everybody, you have different levels, different interests and so forth, so I was imagining that. So I chose these four novels because they're really, really immediate, and they'll tell you a lot about Japanese culture and society and what's actually going on in Japan right now. They've all been written in the last 4 or 5 years, and they're also very, very popular, which means that in each of these stories really sort of, echoes and reverberates with a lot of readers in Japan. So it's a good idea. I'm not interested in how many readers or how many copies of a book. I don't think that that's the way that you can evaluate literature, of course. But as a portal, as an entrance into the culture, into the literature, it might be a good idea to read and to look at certain things and certain authors that are shared a lot by a lot of writers. There's also a writer who lives in Sendai in the north of Japan. His name is Isaka Kotaro. He writes a lot of really, really interesting books that have been very, very popular, have been turned into movies, and that cover a lot of things as well. But as far as language itself and to begin to write, to read in Japanese, novels and poems are very, very good because I think it's very, very difficult. You have to really, really study a lot and read a lot to be able to read, for example, a newspaper. Newspapers are very difficult to read in Japanese for someone from abroad, especially from a non-Japanese character, from the West. They're very, very difficult. But stories and poems are a really good way to imitate people's voices. I always imagine my own, the trajectory of my own learning and becoming fluent in Japanese and writing in Japanese as being a sort of process of stealing, that I've stolen many people's, dozens and dozens of people's voices and the way that they speak and so forth. I'm like a monkey or a parrot or something, that I've spent so much of my life actually listening to people's voices, men and women, children, and imitating the way that they sound. I'm not conscious of that anymore. I have my own voice, hopefully, now in Japanese, and my own style and writing and so forth. But I remember when I was your age, studying in college, that I was very conscious of that. And one very good place to enter and steal things from, I think, are poems and stories, because they have a very, very distinctive, very, very clear tenor and voice. And it's something that you can feel as you read them as well. Among the stories that I introduced today, I would recommend Yomiuri's JR Ueno Eki Koenguchi, Tokyo Ueno Station, because you may have felt some of it, or when I was reading aloud. It's very poetic in some ways, and it's very, very simple. Her prose has been sort of carved down. It's very, very sparse in a way, but it's also extremely, because of the simplicity, the apparent simplicity of it, it reaches very, very deep into us. And it's also simply easy to read. Also, Komi Ningen is, if you've ever been to a convenience store, it's very easy to read because she just spends all of her time in a convenience store. And it's fascinating. It gives a sense of a different kind of voice that you can perhaps steal or borrow or whatever itself. But perhaps later on I'll be able to share, I'll send the professor a list of things that are more specific if I know more about your interests. Thanks for the question. What are you interested in? What sort of interests do you have? What kind of things are you interested in?
My speaking skills with develop my vocabulary. Yeah, it's important to in studying all languages, not only Japanese. It's just interesting. 面白いですね。でも、and 吉典君が待つ場所はとても面白いですね。So, and I think that modern literature is interesting too.
Right, thanks a lot. Japanese literature, not just modern Japanese literature, but classical Japanese literature, also is very oral. Japanese readers didn't read silently until the 1870s or the 1880s. We have a word, it's called reading aloud or reading silently. There's a distinction made in Japanese. And a lot of Westerners who came to Japan in the 1860s and the 1870s, after the opening up to the West, write about this in their diaries. They walk around town and they hear people's voices. What are these people that chanted? What are they reading? It's just people reading, and the act of reading was using your voice, so that a lot of Japanese literature wasn't read, it was heard, something that was oral. And that aspect of being something that's spoken survives in the prose today as well. This is something that I look forward to in the next few days, talking with Ostap Slavinsky as I translate his testimonies of refugees in review, I find that Japanese is it's much easier to adjust levels of being very, very vernacular, very, very common, or being more formal, more educated, whether it's a man speaking or a woman speaking. It has a lot of different tones and tenor that you can use to express what the contents are than in English. English tends to be very, very standard. It's very, very difficult when you're writing English, for example, to capture a different dialect. And it's very difficult today because if you want to write in a dialect which is not your own, someone may accuse you of cultural appropriation or being, discriminatory or something like that. So it's very difficult now in English to have a broad range of different sorts of voices in your own speaking and in your own writing as well. And I want to be able to use that capacity in Japanese to express the voices of people in Ostap Zelinsky's work as I translate it itself. So anyway, a lot of these books have audiobooks as well. You can, through Kindle, through Amazon or anything, or some of them are on YouTube, you can listen to them. They're streamed. And that's a really good way to, if you have the book at hand especially, it's a really, really good way to learn more vocabulary, the cadences, the rhythms of Japanese and so forth. I really recommend literature for that as well. So anyway, ganbatte kudasai. Do we have time for maybe one more question? Okay, there you go.
すみません、私の日本語はとても悪いですから、英語を話します。And for your opinion, would be the book, the dictionary of the word, interesting for the young Japanese people, or maybe more for the older generation? What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to have a sort of discussion with some of you, anyone who wants to remain and has looked through a dictionary or after a session today. But to start that up, I think that it's going to be very, very moving for all generations in Japan. I read some of my translations already on Japanese radio about 3 or 4 weeks ago, a nationally broadcast radio program. A lot of the feedback that I have are from older people, but a lot of younger people as well, who say to me, I've also written in the newspaper about this with some quotes, and most of the voices that I've heard so far are really interested in the fact that everything that we know about what's going on, what has occurred, and what is occurring in Ukraine in the last year and 4 months is the big story of military advances and developments, the sacrifices that people, large populations are making, geopolitical aspects and so forth. But it's we have very, very little access to the smaller stories of people who are actually living in war. Japanese older people are used to reading about experiences during war or during duress. For example, there was a lot of starvation in Japan after the Second World War because there wasn't enough food to nourish people. And there are a lot of novels and books that covered that period in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. And a lot of older Japanese people remember that, remember starvation, remember not having enough to eat, and losing, perhaps, some of their loved ones through malnutrition. That's one example. We have a lot of natural disasters as well, and literature that's written about that. So people who have experience in life, who have lived for a long time, are very, very familiar with that. Younger people who perhaps haven't that experience but are interested in it are fascinated by a dictionary of war because of the very sense of it being very, very specific, very, very concrete. Each story is centered on an object, a letter, an apple, glasses, teeth, a cat, silence, for example, as I showed you. So it's something, these are all words that everyone has with them and that we use every day, and we have our own associations. So young people, the young people that I've talked to with so far, are immediately drawn into each of the stories because of the commonality of each of the stories themselves. I don't want to talk about how I feel about it or what I think about a dictionary of war yet, because I want to hear your opinions afterwards. But it's fascinating. I think different generations. I hope to publish the book in entirety with an essay, a long essay, which I will definitely describe, in which I will describe my experience with you today in as well. I hope to publish it in the fall, in September or October. Here I'm promising that the book is going to be published in October or December, or what's the month after October? It's November. No, not November. September or October. We have an expression in Japanese that says, when you say something like that, the demons laugh. You can hear the demons laughing because they don't believe that you're actually going to be able to do that. But I really look forward to that. Anyway, thanks for asking about that. Once again.
Can you read your Twitter nickname so we can maybe read some of the posts and respond it or something like this?
Okay,
Thank you.
My address, I wrote at the beginning of it. Here's my Twitter address right there. So if you would like to write that down, you can look it up, okay?
Thank you.
And there'll be lots and lots of more. And if you would like to, I would like to invite you and the gentleman up there and the gentleman here talking, and all of the other students here, to write something to, the thread is still alive, okay, and there are still going to be people talking to it. So after you eat lunch, and perhaps in the afternoon, maybe you can open up your device or whatever and search for this, and you can just write one line or two lines or something about what your opinion, what your thoughts were, listening and hearing to what I talked about today. And that would really thrill people. I'm sure that people would be very, very happy to see directly your words returned to them. So thank you for reminding me. That's good. Anything else? Okay.
Sorry, if you read Ukrainian books, what is the most interesting to you?
I'm sorry, once again?
If you read Ukrainian books, what is the most interesting to you?
I'm afraid that I have not read anything. I don't know anything about Ukrainian literature. I'm just I'm bald, but I'm also baldly ignorant of the tradition itself. I'd like to end this apparently endless lecture today. We've gone way beyond the time that was allotted to me, and thank you again for spending that time and allowing me to share some of the words and the thoughts of my friends and a lot of the words that they have with us today. And I'm very, very proud to be able to read these books with you in the library. Maybe we can take a short break, and then maybe some of the students can remain who would be interested in talking to me about their impressions of the dictionary report.
どうもありがとうございました。今も皆さんお茶でも飲みにしたいと思います。Значить, ми робимо невеличку перерву. Перед тим, як буде обговорення книги «Словник війни», робимо півгодини перерву.